Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Antoine Fuqua's film, The Magnificent Seven. So this is the 2016 remake. The original Magnificent Seven came out in 1960, and that was itself not a remake, but a reworking or an adaptation of Akira Kurosawa's 1954 film, The Seven Samurai. The principle of The Seven Samurai and the two Magnificent Seven films is basically the same, right? You have a small, poor village or town that is being terrorized and repressed. Their goods are being stolen, they're being plundered, they're being controlled, etc., by some more powerful, violent external entity. And the people of that town or village send out representatives to go and try and hire essentially mercenaries, right? They go to try and hire people who are skilled at fighting to come and liberate their town or village. So in Fuqua's version of the film, it is the town of Rose Creek, which seems to be in perhaps California, although I don't think it's specified. But the villain, Bartholomew Bogue, goes to Sacramento, so I'm assuming Rose Creek is also in California, somewhere in the West. They are being terrorized by Bartholomew Bogue, who is a mine magnate. There's a gold mine in the area, which also would be consistent with California. The California Gold Rush, of course, started in 1848. Although this is clearly post-Civil War, probably 1880s would be my guess, 1870s maybe. But the sort of premise is that Bogue is trying to drive everyone out of Rose Creek so that he can have the land for additional mining, essentially. And this community of farmers is generally unwilling to go. And so they go out, they send a representative out, Emma Cullen. So they send Emma Cullen, who is this young woman whose husband basically gets murdered in the first few seconds of the film, played by Matt Bomer, who I feel like is quite a famous actor, and he gets killed off in like the third minute of the film, which is quite surprising. But anyway, so Emma Cullen goes out. She and her friend Teddy, they hire initially Sam Chisholm, played by Denzel Washington. He is a sort of bounty hunter / lawman who is remarkably good with a gun, etc. And he's basically the Chris Adams, the Yul Brynner figure of this film, right? So in the original Magnificent Seven from 1960, Yul Brynner is the lead, and he sort of assembles this group to come and help. In this case, Denzel Washington as Sam Chisholm takes that role. He recruits a number of men. Joshua Faraday, played by Chris Pratt. He's a very sort of charming gambler, gunfighter type. Goodnight Robichaux. He was a former Confederate sharpshooter who is now suffering from PTSD and the belief that if he engages in violence again, he will be killed horribly. He's played by Ethan Hawke. Jack Horn, who's actually one of my favorite characters, played by one of my favorite actors, Vincent D'Onofrio. He is this mountain man, scout, tracker, Indian fighter type figure. And I use the term Indian fighter because that's an old term that people used. But he has a reputation for having killed a large number of indigenous Americans. Billy Rocks, played by Byung-Hun Lee, is Robichaud's friend and associate, and he is extremely good with knives. Like he primarily uses knives to kill his opponents. Vasquez, who's a vaquero, a Mexican outlaw, sort of maybe a bandit. It's hard to exactly tell, but we do find out from Chisholm that he is at least accused of killing a ranger. He's played by Manuel Garcia Rulfo. And then Red Harvest, who's a Comanche warrior, played by Martin Sensmeyer. Basically, this sort of group is put together, this sort of motley crew. And one of the things I quite like about it is that in contrast to the original Magnificent Seven, where I believe all of the members of the Seven are white Americans, we here have a multiracial group. So Sam Chisholm is African American, Billy Rocks is Chinese or Chinese American, Vasquez is Mexican, Red Harvest is Comanche. So more than 50% of the Seven are non-white. And that's actually quite interesting, because one of the things about the Old West that I think today we sort of really don't fully reckon with because of Western films is that it was an incredibly multiracial place, right? So among the people who worked as cowboys, at least 40% were non-white. You had large numbers of vaqueros, which were Mexican cowboys. You had large numbers of African-American cowboys. You had a number of people of different ethnicities, including particularly Chinese, but East Asian as well, because East Asians, especially Chinese people, came in large numbers to California looking for work. And some of them expanded beyond California to seek work herding cattle and things like this, right? So you had this very multi-racial, multi-ethnic world of the Old West that in the Westerns of the 50s, 60s, into the 70s is largely reduced to white people doing the majority of the sort of active existing in the world, with Mexicans typically in the background and indigenous people usually sort of off on the peripheries, being a vague threat and often getting killed, right? And of course there are revisionist westerns that challenge this, and I would put Fuqua's I said that name and it didn't sound right, but it is right. I would put Fuqua's Magnificent Seven into that category of like challenging the stereotypes of a traditional 50s, 60s Western. And actually, one of the reasons that I say that is that so many of the shots in this film and so many of the elements of this film are incredibly stereotypical Western stuff, right? Like, the first time we see Sam Chisholm ride into a town, everybody on the street is like, oh no, it's a gunfighter arriving in town. We've got to be worried about this. It's a dude on a horse showing up in your Western town. What, like, this has to happen all the time. It can't be that odd that everybody in town has to be like, oh no, there's going to be a gunfight, right? And I think Fuqua probably has done this quite purposefully, right? And that, like, all the scenes of like people closing their shutters and like, oh, I've got to draw the curtains. There's going to be trouble and all this stuff. And these, like, some of it is echoes of the original 1960 version of it, right? But other elements of it are this thing that you see very often in revisionist Westerns, where they are sort of taking the piss out of these iconic or I can't think of the word that I want for it, right? But they're sort of taking the piss out of these recognizable Western tropes. And I think Fuqua is doing that in a way that's very, very clever, while also still contributing to a good movie that functions within the genre, even as it challenges some of the presuppositions of the genre. I also think there's another really, really interesting thing going on here. Because in the original 1960 Magnificent Seven, you had a Mexican bandit who was terrorizing a Mexican town. In Fuqua's version, you have a white European, or sorry, not European, but a white American capitalist who's terrorizing a town primarily populated by white American settlers. And so you have this interesting tension within the film that I think is a tension in a lot of Westerns, because on the one hand, you have Bartholomew Bogue, who, by the way, is played by Peter Sarsgaard, who I think is really, really good in the role. Bogue says quite early on in the film, and I think this is such a smart thing to have him say, he says that America has long associated, I can't remember exactly what it is that he says, but America has long associated progress with capitalism and capitalism with God. And so by standing in my way, you are standing against God. And I think that's really, really fascinating and really, really smart, because it's true. But it draws our attention to something super, super important, because the idea of, like, the Protestant ethic developed by Max Weber, the theory developed by Max Weber, becomes the prosperity gospel. And that's fundamental to contemporary U.S. evangelical Christianity especially, but right-wing Christianity across the board, right? This idea that despite everything that Jesus says in the Gospels, somehow God loves the rich and wants to make the most righteous people rich. And so there is this very, very direct connection. Bogue is not wrong. And this is what's so fascinating about the film, is that Bogue in many ways represents the reality of American ideology, and American Christian ideology in particular. He is not a deviation from Christian ideology, American Christian ideology. He is, in fact, precisely representing it. And yet he is the villain of the film. And so it's such a fascinating thing when we think about what do the villains of Westerns stand for, and they often do stand for the exact types of forces that are genuinely sort of representative of American ideology. Bartholomew Bogue lays it out directly in the early portion of the film. There is no getting away from it, that he conceptualizes himself as an embodiment of American capitalism, an embodiment of the Protestant ethic, an embodiment of what would come to be called prosperity gospel, and that he therefore is entitled to do what he wants, to kill who he wants, to take what land he wants, because that is the American way. And he isn't wrong. But the film needs to reject that ideology because, and this is again where it gets really, really interesting, because framing that, and I think probably Fuqua is just opposed to that, right? I think there's probably, and this may be reading too much into directorial intent, but I think the film on some level is fundamentally a rejection of that idea that this is true, that this is the truth of America, etc., etc. I think the film is probably opposed to that notion. But what it also reflects is this other sort of fundamental assumption about American ideology, or within American ideology, that one has a basic fundamental right to defend oneself, one's home, one's family, and I don't critique that idea necessarily. And that there's a streak of vigilantism in American culture that is often extraordinarily problematic. And partially, I think this goes back to our heritage as a frontier society, in which there was constant sort of anxiety about particularly indigenous Americans whose lands were being actively stolen and whose people were being actively genocided by settler colonists, etc., etc. But this sort of idea that, like, we are right and justified to band together and kill a whole bunch of people if they threaten our homes, lives, property, etc. Right? It's concerning in the sense that often this type of vigilantism historically has not been used productively, let's say, right? So Bartholomew Bogue, because we have him set up in this film in a particular way, yeah, he is clearly a villain. He is clearly doing bad stuff. We do not necessarily feel bad when he loses and is killed at the end. But in history, oftentimes that this person or this group is a threat that we are justified in eliminating or neutralizing doesn't quite play out in the same way, right? It is often used to oppress religious minorities, ethnic minorities, racial minorities, LGBT people, etc., right? It's often that sort of belief of protecting what is ours with violence is often used in incredibly problematic ways. And so I think the film is interrogating these fundamental elements of American ideology and really problematizing them.